I'm from the Pacific Northwest originally, so my whole paradigm for how the world should look is a much greener one than Northern California. But I've become really like inspired by all the different versions of the shade garden that we have here that they're drier because we don't have rain in the summer. But there's anything from redwood coastal forests that rely on, fog drip during the summer to dry inland oak chaparral where you're trying to keep things as light on the land as possible, but still grow things that would be happy underneath oaks. So there's a big diversity of the world that we live in that includes shade. But I wanted to sort of take a step back because I think when we go down the route of thinking about gardening, this is a slow webinar, we think immediately about plants. What are the plants that I want to include? How can I do this? Why hasn't this thing worked in the past? And what am I doing wrong? Sometimes when we think about the spaces that we have available to us, it's good to remember that there's a lot of other attributes to how you can use the space and make the most of it that is not just reliant on planting, especially if you're dealing with really deep shade where it can be challenging to grow, a lot of different things, a lot of different plants that we're familiar with for, part shade gardens. So it's, the most important thing is to remember that the reason the shade is there is because there's often mature trees that we're dealing with and working with. So you have to remember that any kind of paving material that would be solid or impermeable would not be a good solution. But it doesn't mean that you can't think about how to make the most of the space with decking or gravel paving, which is permeable. That includes decomposed granite. There's different ways to treat the space that you don't have to irrigate. You also don't have to try to grow things that don't want to grow there, but that you can enjoy the space year round. So just a disclaimer for all these beautiful images. A lot of them are not from my garden designs, they're from the internet. So they're just places to get inspired about what's possible. And one of them includes a little gravel seating area, which I'm a big fan of, underneath old trees where you've got a bunch of really big tree roots. You don't want to dig a bunch of big holes. And you may, depending upon the tree species, you don't want to irrigate a lot. So it's actually a really good solution, both in terms of the aesthetic, but also being as kind to the big tree canopy as we can. So I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about the fact that shade, especially in a warming climate, is actually a real gift. I think people think of it as a challenge, but I think in my mind, whenever I'm working with a new client, if they don't have any shade in their garden, I think, how am I going to build shade into this garden? Because it actually makes getting plants started and growing a lot easier because they're not having to essentially be evaporating all of their available water throughout the hot sunny day. They only have to evaporate water through one half of the day. And so the shade canopy is super helpful for giving plants rest from the intensity of the heat. And I think anybody who lives in some of the more southern Marin or San Francisco, they know that you can grow a lot more in a shadier garden than sometimes you can in an open, sunnier garden. So I think of it as a real opportunity. So we'll just head through here. Some of the considerations. So these are like design 101. This is not specific to shade gardening, but I think that it helps to remember again, how do you want to actually use the space as opposed to what can I plant there? I think it's good to open your mind up preliminarily before you jump into plant selection. How could you use the space? Because like I said, it's a protected area in your garden. Maybe it's the spot that has the nicest afternoon, dappled light. It's not as hot and exposed as some of the other areas. So creating a little seating area, having some of the other design elements that you might want to include in a sunnier space, it can actually be a really special protected zone for entertainment and kind of what I consider the aspect of refuge, like having a space in the landscape where you can actually take refuge and have a quiet moment, as opposed to the big sunny areas that I equate with activity, dogs, kids, lawns, all of that. So think about all of those considerations before you just immediately jump in and think, okay, how many plants do I need, and which varieties are they going to be? So
Emily, can I jump in while you're on consideration? So
absolutely.
with both the previous slide and this slide, would you say that it's best to really, like, if you are doing any hardscaping or gravel, do you typically lay out those spaces first, and where like a patio is, before you do the plants, or do you do it the other way around?
The hardscaping always comes first. It's kind of like the backbone, it's like the skeletal system of the whole thing. And I think about it really in terms of these little zones that you're going to create and make the most of. And I personally just start in a very like puzzle piece kind of way. I think, well, what do I want to fit there? How many chairs, if there's room for a fire pit, like how does that all, how much space does that really require? And then oftentimes there's grading that needs to happen. So you have to think about the levels of the garden, how they interrelate. But yeah, the hardscaping, any kind of grading that needs to happen, that all has to kind of get resolved before you jump in with the planting. As much as I am super geeky, plant driven, obsessed with plants, and always will be, that's the last thing you get to play with at the very end. And then of course, then the sky's the limit. You can think about all the cool things you can grow there, but you do really want to figure out where are all the pathways, how does it all interrelate to its, the different areas of the garden. So yes, good point.
Mm-hmm.
And, I brought up who will be in the garden: children, pets, wildlife. It is really good to think about, like, if there's a wildlife kind of aspect to your garden, if there's things that you've observed, if you know that you want to include certain things, that you kind of take that into consideration from the beginning. It's just good. It's a focusing element, because I think as anybody who loves plants or knows about plants, there's literally thousands of plants that you could use in any given situation. So it's almost like it edits out a bunch of stuff that maybe you shouldn't even consider if you're like, well, I really want to make this habitat environment for a lot of different species. So I'm going to think about things from a habitat perspective. And it just clarifies your design, and you can just edit out a bunch of stuff. In this particular picture, what I liked about it was that, again, this is not my design. It's beautiful. It's showing that there are other elements in the landscape that potentially could be attractive focal points, not just plants, although the planting is beautiful and relies pretty heavily on foliage, which is a real attribute to a lot of shade gardens, is the form and foliage contrasts, as opposed to a bunch of exciting flower displays. But yeah, I like the strong forms that they brought in with the little fur mob furniture and the sculptures. I think that it's good, especially if you are in a really challenging shade environment and you literally can't grow but 3 species that you've figured out can live there, that you can use sculpture or pottery as a way to distract from the fact that it's not heavily planted. So I have had to do that with really intensely old canopies that have been there forever, old cedar trees with like really dense root systems. It doesn't matter how many times you try to plant stuff in there, the roots want to suck up all the moisture. And instead of trying to plant a big, maple in the ground, I would put it in a pot. And it's it's a cool focal point, and it makes you appreciate the space as opposed to thinking that it's an impossible space to deal with. The varieties of shade, this is just a sort of a reminder of some of the basics. These are things that I know from having done this for 23 years, but I still try to act like are not true, which is that full shade means 2 hours of sunlight. And there's a lot of gardens, I think a lot of parts of people's gardens that don't even get that. And I think a lot of us sort of have in our minds that we can put a lot of things in there that would be partial shade lovers. They would only do well in partial shade. And we only have an hour of sun in the entire day because of buildings or really big old trees. So it's good just to be honest with yourself. So when you're taking stock from the very beginning, to actually watch it throughout the year a little bit. So in the winter, obviously the sun is a lot lower in the sky. So a lot of different physical things such as buildings or fence lines or neighboring tree lines will potentially block some of the sun that you would normally get during the summer. So it's just good to be honest with yourself about how much sun you truly have throughout the year. Partial shade, 2 to 6 hours of sunlight. I mean, we should all be so lucky to have 6 hours of sunlight in our shade garden. That's not often the case. But I guess that gets into a bigger topic, which is that if you do have that much sun, or you have a dappled sun garden, dappled sun part shade, you can obviously grow a lot of things with flowering plants that you wouldn't normally get to grow in a true shade garden. So it does open up some possibilities. So going back to helping us get inspired and think about what would actually do well in the place where we are. I do sort of think of these two sort of endemic plant communities as being the two totems of where we live, which is redwood forest, which relies upon more moisture, but also has some of its own challenges with the allelopathic qualities of the tree roots. The roots of the redwood are a little bit like a walnut tree, in that they release a chemical that makes other plants hard to grow, and it's a competition suppression technique that the plant does. So they have their own challenges, but they do give you a lot of opportunities in terms of the native plants that were adapted to the environment of living underneath redwood trees. And then we have the oak community, which is usually drier, inland, Mediterranean, but because of the shade is a little bit of what I think of as kind of a biological oasis in the middle of a bunch of prairie land, kind of. So it's an opportunity to grow some of probably the most diverse habitat areas for the oak woodland communities. You get a bunch of plants that make seeds and do flowering and are opportunities for birds to live in. So there's a lot of opportunities underneath the oaks, even though primarily we have to think about not interrupting too much of the root system. I think the old adage from anybody who has ever had oaks on their property and had to be a steward of the oaks is that you're supposed to not plant within 10 feet of the trunk. That's something that I've heard from arborists for years. So in general, from folks who do primarily like native landscaping, which is not what I do, but plenty of people, they say, as long as you start with smaller plants, and so you're not digging larger holes and really messing with the roots too much, you can get away with a lot more. And obviously then it's drip irrigation. And at the very end of the presentation, I have a plant list, which Jen can probably share with whomever is interested, as well as a PDF, but it has on it a bunch of native plants that grow both under redwoods and under oaks that I love, that are what I think of as kind of the stalwart locals who do well in these communities. Let's move on. So troubleshooting. I think this is where a lot of people start with shade. They think of all the plants that they love or maybe are yearning to have in their gardens, and they think that they're not available to them because of the amount of shade that they have. And that's a totally valid perspective, especially if you're trying to grow like vegetables or a bunch of, old-fashioned favorites, things like, purple coneflower or lavender, or it's just herbs, things that you have loved for a long time. They are not well adapted to shade. But like I said, there's so many lovely shade garden plants that are texturally interesting, that are habitat interesting. And personally, as a designer, when I think of plants that kind of fit the bill of what a lot of people ask me for, which are low maintenance, low water, and low maintenance. Those are the three. Both low maintenance. People want a garden that looks good year round. That would be the third. So they're multi-seasonal, and they don't, because they're not flowering, they don't require a lot of deadheading. They don't take up a lot of your garden enjoyment time. You can go into a shade garden and maybe spend one good day in a month and clean it out, and it looks like amazing. So I love that aspect of it. I personally just groove on the colors and the contrasts of all the different leaf types. If you know anything about the way, plants photosynthesize, it's like the sunnier plants, the ones that grow out in full sun, often have the smaller needle-shaped leaves, and they do well with keeping their moisture by not having big giant leaves. So you can get a more kind of tropical look in the shade because those plants are adapted to grab as much sunlight as is available underneath the canopy, but they don't, they're not worried so much about evapotranspirating, getting rid of all their water. So like, for instance, in one of these slides, the Asarum caudatum, the wild ginger, which is one of my favorites, that grows underneath the redwoods. If you ever go up into like Mendocino County, you'll see big carpets of the redwood sorrel, and it's just a lovely plant. It looks super tropical, but once it gets established, it does not take much water. Again, depending upon the amount of shade that you have available. And then another of the slides is the Yerba Buena, which I think a lot of people are familiar with just from hiking, knowing the trails around here. The smell of it. It's got a really cool, minty, herbaceous smell. That's a great, easy trailing ground covery plant that you can grow on the edge of garden walls that kind of drapes down it and fills in quickly, can handle some light, can handle some shade. It's adaptable. I think a lawn replacement class maybe has already been done by Sloat. I'm not totally sure. Jenny, is that true?
Yeah, we do have that. We have the recording available, but
Yeah.
it's always good to talk about it, definitely.
Yeah, so it's something that is on everybody's mind. I think that mostly we're thinking about water conservation, which is our primary consideration for a lot of people right now. But there's also the fact that in many gardens, you just don't have enough sun to support a traditional sod lawn, but you may still have the desire to use the space that way because of kids or dogs or whatever, whoever's active and wants to have a place to run around. So there are now, native sods available. I remember like 15 years ago when I converted or planted a whole new meadow, I had to literally buy little tiny plugs of lawn, like a hair transplant, that came in a cardboard box with tons of paper shavings, and like we had to plant each one 12 inches on center for a 1,000 square foot lawn area. That was the only what
I'm obsessed with native lawns. I use them too all the time.
So John Greenlee's the guy who, if you have your grasses book in your library, he's famous, but he's also semi-local. And I talked to him on the phone. I mean, you could just call him up and he would just chat with you and tell you about lawns. But Now the Festuca rubra or Festuca malate or K-Rex panza. This is a K-Rex panza lawn right here. You can actually get those, some of them from Delta Bluegrass, and they will send them to you in a sod form. The nice thing about them is they really do adapt to partial shade, and they can grow on slopes. Obviously, you have to think about mowing and how, if you care about mowing it, if you want to try to keep some of it shorter to use it in a certain way, then, you know, it's hard to mow on a slope. But like if you're using it for erosion control, there's a lot of cool grasses. And then of course you can overseed it with, you know, native shade tolerant wildflowers, and which is what we would be doing this time of year. Just as we're going into the rainy season, it would be the time of year to start thinking about using seed and passive irrigation, aka rain, and not keeping it, you know, extra irrigation during the summer and just letting it be like a wild meadow, which is what we would have here. You wouldn't, you know, wouldn't be flowering year round necessarily, depending upon your irrigation. So let's see what else we have here. So I talked a little bit about sculpture and art. I think it's good to remember, I think, let me go back here. So troubleshooting, one major element that I've dealt with a lot is privacy and people wanting to grow hedges or wanting to screen out a particular view, not liking something in a particular area. And if it's really deep shade, it can be hard to get a nice dense screen going. So a couple of different ways to think about that. One is maybe you're not going to screen something out entirely. Just like give up on that and think about instead trying to kind of naturally baffle your view a little bit with several individual plants that semi block it from different perspectives, but you're not going to get your traditional hedgerow, you know, because of the deep shade. But maybe you get a grouping of vine maples that, because of the fact that they're beautiful, they actually attract your attention away from the thing that you're trying to block. So instead of thinking about completely blocking something, thinking about focal points and design elements as being something that attract your attention and draw you into a garden in a different way. Anything to do with water, I think, is always a good element to have. And we talked a little bit about habitat gardening. And besides raccoons, there's a bunch of animals that need water and will come to your garden if you have water. So, you know, even a simple like little stone bowl, a dish of water, or a bird bath that you refill, you know, by hand once a week is enough to bring a lot of different insects. It's like a little oasis for them in the summer, and it won't evaporate as quickly as it would in the sun. And it can be just a lovely light reflective kind of design element when you're looking to create more light and brightness in a dark space. And, you know, there's pottery that can bring in kind of a cool attraction for the eye. I'm totally pro using pots in beds, especially if you've got really dense root systems that you have to compete with. I think it's fine to have whatever cool ground cover will grow there, and then use a cool focal point pot with a lovely single species of something. And that can be the substitute for having a really diverse planting in a place that wouldn't otherwise support it. So there's all different ways to kind of draw your eye away from the fact that it's not all heavily planted, or it can't support, you know, completely planted. These are all beautiful slides. I didn't do any of these gardens, but they show you that you can bring in stone and metal and other elements besides just planting. Let's think about, we're already at questions. Are you guys, Jenny, are you ready to field some questions?
Yeah, for sure. And also I just want to sort of like echo what you're saying and support it. I love using pottery too. It's a great way to add color to a dark space or brighten it up if it's a white pot or something like that. And then also I like lighting. Like
Mhm.
if you're talking about like having a maple in a container or having a maple that's going to deflect your eye somehow, just doing some uplighting on it is really an incredible way to sort of, like Emily was saying, diffuse like your view, so it doesn't have to be a solid screen, but it just sort of brings your eye to focus on something that doesn't, it makes you feel like it's a little bit more of a room that you're in or something, right?
Mhm. Totally.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up lighting because I thought about that on the way here this morning. I was just thinking that I didn't include it in the slides, but especially going into the winter, when you're not
Mhm.
in your garden as much, if you come home after we're about to do daylight savings, so like after 5 p.m., there's no light. It's
Mhm.
nice to have the lighting element, and in a shade garden, especially because of the cool leaf textures and shapes, like the possibility of doing like moonlighting, which means putting a downlight fixture attached to some of the trunks. You can do a cool wash of light down the trunk of a tree and then like wash it down onto the smaller kind of ground covery perennial stuff at the base. It's super sculptural, it's year round. And for the winter, especially, it feels like the time when you kind of want to think about how to expand your enjoyment of the garden when you're not in it, during the daytime.
Totally. And it brings that extra element to it too,
Mhm.
which is really nice.
Mhm.
So yeah, we do have several questions. I'll just go down. One I kind of answered, but I think it's important. I think other people would benefit from it. Somebody was asking about growing a Japanese maple in a container and what size container would they require?
Well, Japanese maples honestly are one of the most tolerant of being in a container for a long period of time. Um, I have met trees that have lived in somebody's deck in a container for 15 years, and I'm sure there's some version of them being root bound, but they're seemingly super tolerant of it. So I wouldn't try to shove it in a too small container because generally speaking, going bigger is better. There's the lightweight containers, like if you're dealing with a deck or something that you're worried about the weight of it, use a lighter weight like concrete fiber clay, one of those kind of planters, so that then you're just dealing with the soil, the weight of the soil. But a Japanese maple, I mean, I would say anything, honestly, 2 feet in diameter. I wouldn't go smaller than that because it's a big, there are all different Japanese maples. So there's literally
Yeah,
like hundreds of varieties, and some of them will never get bigger than 3 feet tall, and they do the waterfall thing, which are very cool in containers. But then there's other ones that, if they were in the ground, they would be 40 feet tall. So I'd say bigger is better though with containers.
definitely. I would agree with that. And Sloat has the fiber light containers and actually a lot of pots
Mhm.
that would fit a larger tree like that. So definitely check out our pottery. How do you know how much shade you get in a day? Like how can you track it?
Well, there's probably devices nowadays that you could put out there that would actually literally measure the insolation. SOL is how they measure the amount of light that hits a certain area. But I think for a regular person who's not an ag person, meaning somebody who just wants to do the right thing for their little garden, you would watch it at the beginning of the day and try to make a note of when the sun started to hit it, and then make a note of when the sun started to go away. If it was that kind of shade, again, shade is there's all different versions of shade. There's like the most difficult kind of shade is where it's full shade and then you get 2 hours of blazing sunlight and then it's full shade again.
Mhm.
So in that instance, I honestly would plant like a small tree or something to dapple that amount of shade, because it's so hard to find shade tolerant plants that then can get scorched for 2 hours when the sun is really high overhead. And that usually happens when it's in between two buildings, or, you know, a fence and a building, because these two things are blocking the sun as it tracks, and then suddenly the sun is allowed in and it's scorching, and then it stops. So I think you just have to be like your home scientist, get your little book out, your little post-it pad right next to your dining room window, or wherever you're looking out onto your little shade area, and track when it starts to show up and when it starts to go away. And as far as how much it varies from season to season, you know, most people don't wait to plant something after they've observed their garden for 12 months, but you may have a sense that during this time of year, it's obviously going to be way darker than it would be in the summer, that you get a considerable more amount of shade during the summer than you would right this minute if you were to track it.
Yeah, that somebody else had that kind of a similar question, bouncing off of that. It's just, yeah, through the seasons, like sometimes you'll have full sun in the summer, and then as the sun drops in, you know, in fall, winter, it's like pretty dark shade. And so trying to deal with like what plants can sort of take that extreme, you know, light change. But I like what you're saying about creating, you know, having that dappled shade when it does have full sun, so then it's still, so there's still part shade plants, you know, planting the trees and things like that. I
Yeah,
think that's good.
smaller tree that has like a small leaf that's deciduous. This is where I love deciduous trees. Is like it will help during the summer when you want a little bit of help with the canopy, and then in the winter it drops its leaves. Not only do you get the leaves that then return to the soil and create a natural mulch, which is totally appropriate for shade gardens, but you also get the winter sun. You know, it doesn't block the winter sun. So deciduous trees in shady little pockets near houses are perfect, because they give you some relief from the hot midsummer sun, and then they deciduate and give you all the winter sun that you would want.
What about, and I've seen this a lot too, like any under a deck, like a lot of times people have like under a deck space where you want to fill it with something, but it doesn't really get any direct light, but you don't want to see whatever's under the deck. What do you recommend for that?
So it kind of depends on how high the deck is and what kind of space is under there. You know, if the deck is really low, honestly, I would screen it off and use some cool organic, like, you know, rolled willow screening or something, so that you're actually just literally closing it off. It's not part of your garden, it's not part of your view. But if it's high and like you can walk under there, depending upon what's going on the deck above, where that is, how exposed it is, how much tree drop, you know, leaf drop you have, I'm a big fan of doing some kind of cladding underneath to make it look more finished, meaning some kind of wood or some material underneath, so that you're not just looking at a bunch of spider webby, you know, deck joists. And then like thinking about it more in terms of staging as opposed to just gardening. And that's where the distracting your eye with other elements, as opposed to trying to think, how am I going to plant this whole area? So you may end up using like 3 plants in kind of key spots that you know can take the deep shade, like sarcococa or, you know, whatever. And then and then you put like a little hanging chair and a cute little stone, like lily pads of stone, to kind of get you into your little underdeck area. And maybe you don't use it that much, or maybe your kids use it and it ends up being their fun hideout space. But yeah, it just depends on the kind of access you have to that space, and if it's just for viewing or if you can actually turn it into something that might be usable. But I have found personally, like lighting and some kind of furniture or a little element like that that distracts your eye, as opposed to trying to plant the entire thing, is a good way to go about it.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the list of deep shade plants is not super long, so that edits it down anyways, and I think just makes it easier. I mean, I can think of like 5 maybe that I regularly use for deep shade, and you just can sort of repeat that. And so it's not, 50 different plants. It's just a really clean look with what Emily's saying, some sort of element added to it.
Mhm.
A lot of questions. This is kind of more questions than we normally get. So this is awesome. This is like people want to talk about shade.
Okay.
Yeah. So for shade tolerant wildflowers, now in pre-rainy season, do we plant from seeds or buy small plants?
That's a good question. I mean, again, if the space that you're planting is open to the rain, then I would say definitely by seed. By seed is always the best. Shade is funny. I didn't talk about this earlier, but shade, as far as irrigation is concerned, is a little tricky because, again, you have shade because you have canopy or because you have a building nearby. And the shadow of that canopy or of the building is also a rain shadow. So in the winter, you go to the rest of your garden and it's been raining for a week and you dig down underneath the soil and it is wet. It is like waterlogged wet. And then you go underneath the canopy of a big old tree and it's fairly dry under there. So the tree is getting the moisture, the tree's fine, but the little plants underneath can sometimes be at a disadvantage. And that's why I think in the winter, a lot of times people lose a lot of plants in shady gardens. They're like, I don't know, this one was doing well. And then it just stopped, and oh yeah, it actually dried up and died in the middle of our very, very rainy winter. So if you have the ability, because you're actually planning something from the get-go, try to zone your irrigation so that those rain shadow places are separate from the rest of the garden. Because now with irrigation management being so fine-tuned because we have to make every drop count, we have rain sensors and we have weather data enabled irrigation controllers that use all of the real-time information to say whether or not something should be watering or not. However, if it's been raining for a week and your under deck area isn't getting any of that rain, you want to be able to separately decide that one zone is not reliant on the rain sensor. So if you can zone your irrigation correctly, yeah, you can plant little plants. Obviously you'll see where they're going to pop up because you're planting them and then you can irrigate them properly. But if it's in a more open area that does get the advantage of the rain, then I would say seed is great. They're always more robust. It's easier to start, but more difficult to put drip irrigation out for that, obviously.
Okay, I just want to say that I'm working right now on getting the PDF that Emily mentioned about her list of plants. So we'll get that up on our website. And if you email me, I'll email you once it's up on our website. Oh, there it is. Oh, good.
Yeah, I put it
take a
at the
screenshot.
end.
Yeah.
I put it at the end, but I don't want you guys to madly be taking notes. We'll just somehow put it up so you guys can access it later.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely get it on our website. You can screenshot it right now. But if you want, I can email you once it's up on our website. I'm just waiting for that to happen right now.
Yeah. And there are 2 pages. And this is, you guys, it's so hard to make a plant list from 1 million things that you could plant and very, very, very different shade conditions that some of these things thrive in. But these are things that I really do love and I do use. So I tried to whittle it down. And then I looked at the list this morning and said, oh, I forgot Daphne. Daphne's one of my favorites. Oh, well.
I love Daphne.
There's always one that you forget.
I know. Somebody asked where to get plants for Shady Hillside Sloat Garden Center.
Yeah, absolutely. I love Sloat. I am not just doing this webinar because Jenny's my friend. I shop at Sloat all the time because they excel at special ordering stuff. And so if you're looking for something unusual or something that requires a little bit of forethought, I mean, they have a ton of stuff. It's not like they don't have a ton of stuff in stock, but when you have to special order, there just aren't that many nurseries that are that good at tracking stuff, and they actually track it and they actually tell you when it's in. So they're excellent.
Nice. Well, there's more, let's see. I guess one more thing. What's your favorite shade, like flowering plants?
Hmm. Which of your children do you love the best? Be honest. Well, shade flowering plants. I mean, this time of year, it's hard not to say Sarcocoa, because Sarcocoa, the smell is so magical. The flower is pretty insignificant if you know what that looks like. It's called sweet box because the leaves are kind of small and waxy like a boxwood. And the flowers are sort of small and waxy and sort of cream colored. I wouldn't say insignificant. I think they're pretty, but they are so fragrant. And like they'll stop you in your tracks, kind of like a mock orange or a citrus or something like that. As far as flowering, like if you get a little bit more sun, I love witch hazel. You know, they flower in the winter when nothing else is doing it yet. They flower on bare branches, kind of like a dogwood or a magnolia, but they have these crazy blossoms that are like little dangly petals that dangle down. I put one of the witch hazels on here, the Diane, which is a slightly burnt orange, kind of reddish color. And the witch hazel has gorgeous fall color, like ridiculously beautiful fall color. So if you can get your hands on any kind of witch hazel, that's a neat plant. And they do well here. I don't know why they're not more popular. I mean, they're definitely more of an East Coast thing. You see them over there and they're giant, but they do well here.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of a hydrangea girl. Like I like hydrangeas and heuchera. I really like the heuchera too, or campanula. Like if you want more of that, like I guess that's kind of more like English garden
Yeah.
type of look. Yeah.
One of my all-time favorites, which a lot of people don't know as much, is the Thalictrum, the meadow rue,
Yeah.
which has the really ferny foliage. It looks like a maidenhair fern almost, and then it shoots up these stalks, and they're beautiful and super long flowering. Oh, that is the end.